I have a reading to share with all of you this morning. It's a slightly longer reading than I sometimes share, so I just ask that you settle in with me for a moment. I'm reading from Exodus chapter 14, verses 19 through 31. And I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version, although I have gone through and taken out all of the gender references to God, so God is ungendered within the text. So Exodus chapter 14, verses 19 through 31. The angel of God, who was going before the Israelites, moved and went behind them. And the pillar of cloud moved from the front of them and took its place behind them. It came between them and the army of Egypt. And so the cloud was there with the darkness, and it lit up the night. One did not come near the other all night long. And then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. God drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night and turned the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. The Israelites went into the sea on the dry ground, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. But the Egyptians pursued and went into the sea after them, all of the Pharaoh's horses and chariot drivers. At the morning, God watched in the pillar of fire and cloud and looked down upon the Egyptian army and threw the Egyptians into a panic. God clogged their chariot wheels so that they turned with difficulty. And the Egyptians said, "Let us flee now from the Israelites, for God is fighting for them against the Egyptians." And then God said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the water may come back up upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots and chariot drivers." So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at dawn the sea returned to its normal depth, and the Egyptians fled before it, but God tossed the Egyptians into the sea, and the waters returned and covered the chariots and the chariot drivers and the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into sea. Not one of them remained. But the Israelites, they walked upon dry ground through the sea, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. Thus God saved Israel that day from the Egyptians. And the Israelites saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore, and they saw the great work that God did against the Egyptians. And the people then feared God and believed in God and in God's servant Moses. I don't typically bring messages about this passage. I think the last time that I brought a message, the last and I think only time that I've brought a message about this particular story, I just read the first part of the story, the part where Moses parts the sea before the Israelites so they can escape from slavery and from the Egyptians who are pursuing them. I cut the passage before it got to the part about how God drowns the Egyptian army. You see, the idea of God drowning the army of Egyptians makes me uncomfortable. I don't believe in a God who could enact violence against anyone. And the idea of God killing wholesale an entire army of people is incredibly distasteful to me, and maybe to some of you as well. But here's the thing. Something that I constantly say to myself, and that I have said to many of you as well, something that I remind myself of over and over and over again. Scripture does not need to be read literally. In fact, I believe that it should not ever be read literally. And this is hard for us. It's hard for me because we are all post-Enlightenment people. We all want to read things literally because we have been taught to do so. We want to read things like a textbook, like a historical account. We want the words to literally mean one thing so we can figure them out. But the truth of my faith is that it does not matter what the text says. It matters what it means. It matters what it teaches us about God and about ourselves. Even so, I have tended not to read the passages that I find upsetting, like this account of God drowning the army of Egyptians. And yet it was still this passage that called to me in recent weeks, because it is a story that is fundamentally about freedom. It's a story about the Israelites held in bondage for generations by the Egyptians, being liberated by God. And that story has profound implications for us today here in 2020 in the United States, a country that was founded on slavery and that continues to be intrinsically racist. So what does this story mean? What does it mean that God parted the seas before the Israelites as they were being pursued by their enslavers? What does it mean that God then destroyed the pursuing army of Egyptians, drowning and crushing them in the returning waves? I would invite you with me to let go of the idea of God literally doing this. I do not believe in a God who would kill an army of people. Let's look deeper at what this story is teaching us about ourselves and about the divine. This story means, in part, that God cares about freedom. Not just generally freedom, but liberation from slavery. And not just slavery, but generational slavery, generational oppression. This is a story that teaches us that God cares ultimately about liberation from oppression, long-term generational oppression. The Israelites are led out of bondage, outward toward liberation through the sea. And this is an incredibly powerful image for me. The image of those struggling toward liberation being met by what seems like a vast obstacle, an insurmountable challenge. They're cornered on the shores of the sea, and they stare down an approaching army of Egyptians. They do not have boats to cross the water. They do not have time to figure out an alternative route. The obstacles to freedom are significant. And then the divine sweeps in and parts the water. It is a moment like all of the miracle narratives in Scripture, a moment that teaches us that things that we thought were impossible can become possible. It's a story that means that we humans can be limited in our thinking because of habit, and culture and tradition, that we are limited in what we think is possible. But the divine is limitless. The divine can bring forward things that seem truly unbelievable. And in the story of the parting ocean, the ocean is every impossible obstacle to liberation. It is the things that seem vast and unchanging, the things that seem too great and too horrible and too hateful to ever really change. The ocean is the vast system of racism in our country, so seemingly insurmountable. But the story does not end with the parting of the ocean. It's a story that also teaches us about human evil. Because the Israelites, they just don't happen to be enslaved. They're in bondage because the Egyptians enslaved them for generations. For generations, they were oppressed. And the Egyptians, they're not just letting them go. They're just not setting them free. Instead, when slavery legally ended in the United States, it wasn't a moment that was marked by significant liberation. Instead, there was sharecropping and the mass incarceration of Black people in this country because convicted criminals could be forced to work for free. It ushered in the Jim Crow era and the lynching era of American history. Slavery may have technically ended, but forced labor, systemic oppression, intentional, legal ways of oppressing others, those things continued on. Oppression did not end with the end of slavery, and it didn't end with the civil rights movement of the 1960s. It didn't end because of human evil. It didn't end because there is profit in oppression in this country. Because hate is a powerful thing. Because humans do terrible things to each other. The Egyptians pursue the Israelites into the desert. They're set on death and destruction, pursuing them like the slave catchers in the United States, like the laws that criminalize Blackness, like the systems big and small that lessen the worth of Black lives and dehumanize. And when the ocean parts, the Egyptians, they pursue them on into the ocean, so bent upon destruction. And then God crushes them beneath the water. And it is a complete and thorough rejection of everything that the Egyptian army represents. The continual and ongoing oppression, the human drive to damage and dehumanize, the hate and the fear and the horror of racism, all of that is completely and thoroughly rejected in the crashing water and the ocean waves. It is crushed beneath the returning water. And the Israelites, they travel on and they are truly free. This story means that God is about liberation, not just the easy fixes, the things that we see as possible, not just the incremental steps or the politically expedient decisions, the things that won't ruffle too many feathers, the civil and easy solutions that allow the privileged to go to bed at night still comfortable, knowing that things will continue on as they have. No, God is about liberation that may seem impossible. God is about liberation that washes away every last trace of oppression. God is about a world that may not even seem possible to us, about profound change, true and lasting freedom. God is about something that is so powerful, so big, so terrifying that maybe those of us who are white might feel uncomfortable reading this story about oppression, about liberation from bondage. The liberation that leaves no traces of oppression behind. And what is this story teaching us about ourselves? For us white people, we are not the Israelites fleeing to freedom. No, I know that it doesn't feel good, but we are in this story as the Egyptians, caught up and benefiting from systems that privilege us from birth. This is a story that teaches us that the impossible is possible, that liberation from these systems is possible even when it seems like racism is something so vast that we can never fully defeat it. This story is also teaching us that God, who is on the side of the liberator, may call us forward in ways that are difficult, ways that are painful or uncomfortable, that God may move us forward in ways that are not easy, in ways that we could have never predicted, that we may be required, that we will be required to change and to grow, that we may feel swept up into situations that are difficult, that call us to be something that we have not been before. But no matter how difficult those crashing waves may be, they are calling us forward into the truth of the Spirit. That the divine is a spirit of liberation. This story is teaching us that humans are capable of terrible evil, but that there is a better way, a way of mercy, a way of justice, a way of peace, a way of love, a way into a world that we can just barely glimpse, a world that may seem impossible to us right now. And in the end, it is what we do with this story that truly matters. How it can change us, how it is changing us. In this case, the story of the parting sea and God's complete commitment to liberation. It connects my spiritual life to the work of justice. It is an affirmation of what is at the heart of our spiritual tradition, at the center of our lives as Quakers and people of faith, a truth that we have so often ignored or twisted, the truth of what a life of faithfulness truly looks like. Today, I want you to hear again the good news that is ringing not just in this story, but that rings throughout Hebrew scriptures and throughout the New Testament. The truth that the Spirit leads us to justice because that is the nature of the divine. The truth that the living presence is ultimately concerned with the liberation of the oppressed. The truth that this is our work to do. Not just today, but for every day to come. The truth that our faith teaches us that Black lives matter. Not just when something terrible happens and hashtags fill Instagram, but every day and for every day to come. Let us together hear again the meaning of the story of Moses parting the water and leading the Israelites into freedom. And as we hear again this story, may we hear again the call of the Spirit. And may we bring that call into our time of waiting worship this morning. And together may we hold these queries. What can you do to follow the urgings of the Spirit that urge us toward liberation? And what is one thing that you can do today, this week, this year? What is one thing that you can do in this spiritual work of liberation and justice?